Welcome to the Peripheral System lecture. This is going to introduce you to the nervous system, and at the end of this PowerPoint, you're going to have a list of cranial nerves that I'm going to need you to memorize. So we're going to start with just the basics. What is the nervous system? Well, the nervous system is a system of receptors and nerves that get integrated in your brain. So the receptors we're talking about here are called exteroceptors, or interoceptors, or proprioceptors. These are the locations of where sense receptors are going to be found around your body in order to send the sensations to the brain to be integrated. Exteroceptors are found outside the body, so near the surface of the body. So think of receptors on your skin. What can you feel on your skin? Well, touch, pain, pressure, and temperature. These are all considered exteroceptors because they're outside the body. Then you have interoceptors, and this is to sense things in your visceral area. If you recall, the word viscera or visceral means internal. Visceral receptors can be found in your mouth, so your taste, in your nose, so your sense of smell. They're found in your tissues like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle to measure stretching. And they can act as temperature receptors as well internally, so you can feel when your core is warmer or cooler. The third location of receptors, this is kind of a cool one. These are called proprioceptors, and these are going to be located again in skeletal muscle, tendons, joints, and ligaments. All of those areas where you have movement of the skeletal system. What proprioceptors do is they measure how much or how far those joints are moving to let you know, hey, you're taking a very large step right now, or hey, you're taking too small of a step for these particular stairs. The ability of you to stand at the top of a set of stairs, look down at the stairs, understand how deep each step is, and then take the appropriate step to get down each step, that's proprioception. It might not seem amazing to you, but think about when you drink alcohol. When you drink alcohol, proprioception is one of the first senses that you lose. This is why a lot of people who are drunk stumble or fall downstairs. They're unable to calculate how far to move their joints and how strongly to take the next step. Eventually, all three of these receptors will send a signal to your central nervous system. Now, in those locations, you have different types of receptors. Each of these 5 types of receptors is able to sense a different type of signal. For example, mechanoreceptors sense mechanical signals. So any kind of stretching, pressure change, vibration, itch, all of that is measured by mechanoreceptors. Now, the one type of mechanoreceptor I want to give you the name for is called a baroreceptor. Baroreceptors start with the prefix baro. If you know what a barometer does, a barometer is a measuring tool that measures pressure. So baroreceptors are going to be receptors that monitor blood pressure. Where do you think baroreceptors are going to be found? Baroreceptors are found in your heart and your blood vessels. The second one is thermoreceptors. This measures temperature changes, so the prefix thermo. Chemoreceptors measure chemical changes, because it has the prefix chemo. Photoreceptors measure changes in light. We're the only place that humans have photoreceptors. Where's the only place we can perceive light? Well, in the eye. The last one is called a nociceptor. These are receptors for pain, and they're found everywhere in your body, internally, externally, in the joints. And that's a really good thing because it's important to understand when you're feeling pain in certain parts of your body so that you can stop using that area in hopes that it's going to be repaired automatically. So we talked about the receptors, but the receptors need to somehow get to your spinal cord and to your brain. They do this with these connecting highway systems called spinal nerves. So if I kept drawing this spinal nerve out this way, let's say, and it stopped right here. This would be my receptor. My receptor would sense maybe a feather tickling you. The signal would get sent through a spinal nerve into the spinal cord, and once it's in the spinal cord, it's considered to be part of the central nervous system until it makes its way up to the brain. There are a few pairs of spinal nerves. I don't need you to know the numbers of pairs that there are, but I do need you to know the order of these pairs, starting from top to bottom. The top region of spinal nerves, they're called cervical nerves. Then you've got your thoracic nerves. Then you've got your lumbar nerves, sacral nerves, and coccygeal nerves. If you notice, these names are basically the same names as the names of the vertebrae we learned. Now we're getting into the spinal cord, and this is a great illustration for your next lab practical. Be sure to star this illustration. So what this illustration shows is a cross-section of the spinal cord, and it shows you the dorsal side, and it shows you the ventral side. The word dorsal, like the dorsal fin of a dolphin, means the back of it. So this is pointing towards your posterior. This is the ventral side pointing towards your anterior. And what you'll see is that you have incoming and outgoing nerves from the spinal cord. I'm going to get my pen again. So when you have an incoming nerve signal, it comes in through the dorsal side, and then an outgoing signal goes out through the ventral side. Now, right here, usually that signal shoots up to the brain to get integrated. And what that means is the brain decides what to do with this incoming signal. If it's a signal for pain, the brain's going to send an outgoing signal to say, hey, move out of the way. If it's a signal that something is too hot, it's going to say, hey, move your hand out of the way over the flame. It's too hot. So the brain will decide and integrate those signals. So looking at just this image again, what you see is that you have a dorsal side and a ventral side. One of the biggest differences between the dorsal and the ventral side is that the nerves in the dorsal side are all incoming nerves. Every single nerve you find on the dorsal side will be an incoming nerve. So any dorsal region of your spinal cord will have all of the sensory nerves that sense information and send it into the CNS to eventually go up to the brain. You'll also notice that there's this bulge-like structure, only in the dorsal side though. This is called the dorsal root ganglion. If you recall, when we were talking about cells way in the beginning of this class, we talked about what ganglions were. When you have several cell bodies clustered together, let's draw all of our cell bodies of our neuron. This cluster of cell bodies in the neuron, this region here, it's called a ganglia. It is the bulkiest part of the neuron since the axon is so thin. So all of those cell bodies are in here, and their axons are making their way into the spinal cord. Hence, this region is called the dorsal root ganglion. The nerve goes into the spinal cord, shoots up to the brain to get integrated. The brain sends a signal back down to the spinal cord, and that signal will leave out of the ventral root. Now, there are two terms here, a root and a horn. The horn is just this initial opening region of the spinal cord. So you've got the dorsal horn here, and you've got the ventral horn here. It is going to be the tips of this butterfly-looking structure called the gray matter. So the dark is the gray matter, and the light color around it is the white matter. The top two tips of the gray matter are called the dorsal horns. The bottom two tips of the gray matter are called the ventral horns. The incoming branch of nerves, that's called a root. So this is a dorsal root, ventral root, and ventral root. Be sure that you're able to label this illustration because this will definitely be on the lab practical. So here's a great example of how those nerves move in and out of the spinal cord. So anything in blue is going to be an incoming sensory nerve. So let's go ahead and tie that together. So sensory nerves are my blue ones. Motor nerves are my red ones. So if you have receptors on your arm and you feel a slight tickle on your arm, that sensation of the tickle will be picked up by mechanoreceptors, sent through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root ganglion. See, here's a cell body, here's a cell body, and enter through the dorsal root into the dorsal horn, and once it's in here, it goes up to the brain. The brain says, hey, you know what? I don't like that feeling of someone tickling my arm. So it sends a signal back down through the ventral horn, out the ventral root, and through the ventral region to go and innervate, let's say, your bicep. You contract your bicep, the hand moves out of the way, and the tickling stops. This is a typical reflex where you sense something, you send it into the spinal cord to go up to the brain. Brain says, hey, I like that, or hey, I don't like that. Sends a signal back down out of the ventral side to then innervate a different part of your body. In this case, it was a muscle. So the blue one is called a sensory fiber because it's sensing things. The red one is called a motor fiber because it's causing some sort of motor reflex to occur. So in terms of what kind of reactions your body can make as an outgoing signal, the only outgoing motor response that your body can make that's voluntary will be to your skeletal muscle. Any other place that your brain sends a signal to, like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, endocrine glands, salivary glands, mucus cells, all of those are involuntary. I mean, if you think about it, if you sat there and said, heart rate, increase, or digestive system, lower your function, it wouldn't work. The only thing that you could control is saying, hey, bicep flex. Hey, quads, flex. Hey, anterior muscles, relax. So any of the outgoing signals that you are not able to control, those automatic ones, is part of a nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is a system of sending out motor signals from the brain out the spinal cord to destinations that are not in your voluntary control. But here's the thing about the autonomic nervous system. There's two pathways to it. Either sending out signals through the parasympathetic pathway or sending out signals through the sympathetic pathway. The parasympathetic response is your relaxing response. Lower heart rate, increased digestive functions, pupils not so dilated. But then if your body decides that we're in panic mode, it's going to elicit the sympathetic response, where it turns on the increased heart rate, lower digestive system, increased brain function, and dilate those pupils to have better peripheral vision. In the next few slides, I'm going to give you the main differences between these two systems of activation. So, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. These guys innervate all of the same structures, but their responses are opposite. For example, both of these nerves that come from your spinal cord or your brain will innervate your heart. Same organ, they're both innervating the heart. But this one increases heart rate, which means what do you think this one does? It decreases heart rate. So this is what we mean by they innervate the same structures, but their opposite results is what is key here. So in red, these are the main things that I need you to memorize. The sympathetic response, main things that are going to happen here. If you're panicking, what are some things you notice that change about your body? Well, your heart rate goes up, your breathing rate goes up, and because you're breathing faster, you're getting more oxygen into your body. Because your heart rate's higher, you're pumping more blood throughout your body. which is great because if the panic is set because somebody is chasing you, you need more blood and oxygen to your skeletal muscles to run. You vasoconstrict. That means you're going to constrict the diameter of blood vessels to places you don't need. Some organs that you don't need while you're running away from, let's say, a bear is your urinary system. You don't really need your digestive system. You don't really need your reproductive systems. So you constrict the blood going to those areas. Now, I'm not saying you're completely cutting off the blood going to those areas, because what would happen to those organs if you completely cut blood supply to them? They'd probably die. You're just lowering the amount of blood to detour it to places that you do need. What do you need when you're running away from a bear? Well, your heart needs more. Your brain needs more. Your lungs need more. Bullet point 3, you're going to dilate your pupils. You want to have better peripheral vision to see where that bear is in terms of catching up with you. Now, the parasympathetic response, again, innervates the same places, but it's going to do the opposite effect. Right now, as you're just sitting here relaxing, your body's in the parasympathetic division. The whole goal here is to conserve energy, keep the heart rate down, keep the digestive system moving to keep absorbing nutrients, excrete waste in the urine, get rid of feces, regulate the respiratory rate. Everything's down at your baseline levels. So this illustration is actually a great illustration because it really does show you that the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division, they're innervating the same places. Eye, salivary gland, lungs, heart, bladder, genitals. But you'll notice that the signs are different on them. So one big difference I want you to notice, and I will circle this for you, is the parasympathetic division sends nerves out directly from the brainstem, called the cranial region, and from the sacral region of the spinal cord. Most of the parasympathetic nerves that allow you to relax, they come straight out of your brain. For example, the pons and medulla, these two bumps over here. The pons and medulla send out parasympathetic nerves to relax your body. This is not in your spinal cord. This is directly in your brain. The rest of the spinal cord, if you notice, all green. That's going to the sympathetic nervous system. So from the thoracic and lumbar regions, these guys will innervate sympathetic. And then again, back down to the sacral region, these guys are there for the parasympathetic. So cranial and sacral regions is where you'll find outgoing nerves for parasympathetic. Thoracic and lumbar regions is where you'll find outgoing nerves for sympathetic. I'd like you to look over these organs and see the signs next to them. For example, the parasympathetic nerve innervates the heart to lower it, but it innervates the salivary gland to increase its function. Make sure you're familiar with these organs and what's happening during each. But a great way to remember it so that you don't just have to memorize everything is to understand, what do you need when you're running away from a bear? Well, you need to dilate your pupils. You get goosebumps. Your lungs need to increase their function. Making saliva is not that important. If you notice, when you're in panic mode, your mouth kind of gets dry. Your heart rate goes up. Anything associated with digestive system function, stomach, pancreas, gallbladder, it's going to lower. The liver increases function because one of the jobs of the liver is to release sugar into your body so you can get energy from it. The adrenal gland makes adrenaline. Bladder, you don't really need. You're not focusing on making urine. And peculiarly enough, the genitals are upregulated because ejaculation is considered a sympathetic response. So how can you differentiate between sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves? Well, the sympathetic nerves come from the thoracic and lumbar region. We saw that over here. Thoracic and lumbar region, you have all your sympathetic nerves. So we call it the thoracolumbar region. Parasympathetic nerves come out of the cranial sacral region. So just locations of where they're coming out of the CNS. Number 2 is something I want to draw for you. Let's say this is your spinal cord. The length of the postganglionic fiber. The word postganglionic. Post means after. Ganglionic means cluster of cell bodies. So I'm going to draw 2 examples coming out of the spinal cord. Here's a neuron, and it's sending a signal to a second neuron. Notice that the second neuron is much longer. The other one here, there's a really long initial neuron, and it sends a signal to a much smaller second neuron. This region is called the ganglion. It is where you have a cluster of cell bodies. I know in these illustrations I only drew 1, but in real life there would be like maybe 15 to 50 different cell bodies, all sending signals out. So the length of the postganglionic fiber. What does post mean again? After. So we're talking about this fiber here or this fiber here. Both of these are considered postganglionic fibers. The length of the postganglionic fiber in the sympathetic nervous system is going to be long, very long. The length of the postganglionic fiber in the parasympathetic nervous system is really short. So based off of the length of that postganglionic fiber, that will tell you if it's a sympathetic or parasympathetic nerve fiber. The other part of this is branching. So if you have a sympathetic nerve fiber, it's going to send signals to your heart, to your lungs, to your brain, and to your, let's say, digestive system, all at one time. Whereas the parasympathetic one branch will just go maybe to your digestive system and maybe your urinary system. It needs another neuron to send a signal to other locations in your body. So the branching of sympathetic is much more than parasympathetic. The last thing here is what kind of chemical are they releasing onto the organ? So remember we said that sympathetic and parasympathetic both innervate at the heart. But sympathetic increases heart rate, parasympathetic decreases heart rate. This is mainly because of the type of neurotransmitter they release. The sympathetic nerves release norepinephrine. This is a version of adrenaline. When this goes to the heart rate goes up. Parasympathetic nervous system releases a chemical called acetylcholine. When that goes onto the heart rate stays regulated at a baseline. Now in parentheses, I added the types of receptors for you. Norepinephrine binds to adrenergic receptors in the heart. Acetylcholine binds to cholinergic receptors in the heart. When this binds to this, it causes an increase in heart rate. When this binds to this, it causes regulation and baseline of heart rate. So I'm using heart rate as the example, but just know by no means is that the only example. Norepinephrine can also function in the lungs and bind to adrenergic receptors in the lungs to increase lung function. Same with acetylcholine. It can bind to cholinergic receptors in the digestive system to increase digestive system function. So make sure you know these 4 differences between parasympathetic and sympathetic. Now, the next few slides that have this green chart on them, do not memorize them. What I've given this to you for is to look at the organ system and what happens in each of the responses. There will be a section on the test that asks you what happens to, let's say, digestive function during the parasympathetic response, respiratory function during the sympathetic response, and you have to say increase or decrease for each of them. If you have issues with this or if you're struggling with this, go ahead and let me know through email, and we can find time to talk and I can give you easy ways to remember all these. So the next group of sensors we're going to talk about are going to be called visceral sensory neurons. The word visceral means internal. The word sensory means, of course, we're sensing some sort of sensation and sending that signal to the brain. Internally, what are some things you feel? Well, you can feel pain, like cramps. You can feel fullness of your stomach, so stretching of the stomach. You can feel like your bladder is going to explode, so stretching of the bladder. You can feel sensations of itching. You can feel sensations of temperature changes. You can feel chemical changes, like in your taste buds. That's considered visceral. And what's really important from this slide is when I'm talking about pain down here, internal or visceral pain. Let's say you tear one of your internal organs. If you tear an internal organ, that location where the tear is found must release pain chemicals that bind to pain receptors called nociceptors in order to perceive that sensation of pain. If the torn tissue does not secrete pain chemicals, you will not perceive the sensation of pain. So it's kind of crazy to think, man, you could have damaged tissues inside of you, and there are some tissues that just won't secrete pain chemicals. More often than not, they will, but nociceptors require binding to pain chemicals in order to send the signal of pain to your brain. Now, here's one more pathway that I'd like you to know, and this is going to be that visceral sensory pathway. I did talk about pain in this last slide, but this illustration is very generic for any type of visceral signal you have. So, lucky for you, it's almost identical to the one you already learned. When you sense visceral pain, you sense it in receptors. The receptor goes through the dorsal root ganglion, through the dorsal root to the dorsal horn, and once it's in the spinal cord, it shoots up to the brain. Brain decides what it wants to do with it, sends a signal back down out of the ventral horn, the ventral root, and the ventral pathway. Now, what makes this different is, and only for sensory visceral signals, is that when you sense a visceral signal incoming and you send a motor visceral output, that visceral output can actually go through this little loop-de-loop here called the autonomic ganglion. Normally, when you have a signal going out, it has to just go out at that level. But with the autonomic ganglion, the signal can enter in to this nervous system and travel all the way down parallel to your spinal cord and exit at a different level of the spinal cord. So let's say you are walking through a scary maze, and that scary maze makes a very startling sound. And that sound is something that you perceive. And that sound goes into your spinal cord. Sound goes to your brain, and the brain says, uh-oh, that sounded really startling. We should probably run away. So from the area where you perceived sound, it's probably closer to your head, right? Because that's where your ears are. But the brain said, run away. So you send an output signal through the ventral region to loop around the autonomic ganglia and travel all the way down to your legs to say, hey, legs, you need to move. We need to run away from this scary sound or this maze. So the ability when you're panicking to perceive signals in one area and cause effects in another area is done through the autonomic ganglion. And this is the last mechanism you'll get from me on this PowerPoint. And this is about the heart. So this is one of my favorite ones. I will say that this is, I think, 2 or 3 questions on your next lecture exam. Make sure you're reading through these steps. This whole mechanism is a mechanism of visceral sensory, again, visceral meaning internal, and sensory, you're sensing something. And if you recall, here's the aorta, and here's the brachiocephalic artery that branches into the right subclavian and the right common carotid. This common carotid artery goes up to your brain. Let's say something happened and your blood pressure just shot up. Do you want very, very high pressure blood going into the delicate blood vessels of your brain? Well, no, because what can happen in your brain if blood pressure is too high? It can explode. You can have an aneurysm, you can have hemorrhaging inside the brain. So what we have that's really cool is right here in the common carotid artery, there's a baroreceptor. Remember what baroreceptors measure? Like a barometer? They measure pressure. When pressure is too high, it's going to stimulate the baroreceptor. This baroreceptor will then send a signal through this visceral sensory fiber up to your brain. In your brain, you're going to integrate that signal, and the brain's going to be like, you know what, that pressure is way too high. We need to find a way to ameliorate the situation, to make it better, to either lower pressure or somehow lower the amount of blood getting to the brain so that we don't have a situation like this. So the integration occurs, and we send a signal out through number 4, and 4 is called the vagus nerve. Memorize this name, the vagus nerve. The outgoing signal from the brain goes through the vagus nerve, and it goes and innervates your SA node and your AV node. If you recall, those are the 2 nodes that control your heart rate. The vagus nerve is going to decrease your heart rate because if your heart is pumping slower, you're pumping less blood out of the aorta, so less blood out of the carotid, which means you're going to end up lowering the pressure of blood to the brain. So the 2 nerves here that you must know are number 2 and number 4. Number 2 is called the glossopharyngeal nerve, and number 4 is called the vagus nerve. So the baroreceptor sends a signal up through the glossopharyngeal nerve, then the brain sends an output signal back down through the vagus nerve to lower your heart rate. This slide, I'm going to put a few different stars on it because you have to memorize this slide. Your lab manual also has the functions of these cranial nerves, but your lecture exam, I took the descriptions directly out of these descriptions here. And it's important to read these descriptions because these descriptions sometimes are really similar. Like look at number 3 and 4. Oculomotor and trochlear nerves. Ocular motor is described as 4 of 6 of the extrinsic eye muscles. The trochlear is just extrinsic eye muscles. So I specified the oculomotor as 4 of 6 of the extrinsic eye muscles. And I think your lab manual just calls them innervation of extrinsic eye muscles. So make sure you learn these definitions. These 12 nerves I've listed here, olfactory nerve, optic nerve, facial nerve, vagus nerve, these are all called cranial nerves. When you see the word cranial, you should think brain. Cranial nerves are nerves that come directly from the brain. Normally you've learned that a nerve goes in to the spinal cord, travels up to the brain, back down the brain, and out the spinal cord. But there are other nerves that will travel into the spinal cord, up the brain, and straight out of the brain to innervate places. You only have 12 of these nerves. They are very special, so we call them cranial nerves, and we number them. Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve. This is one of the biggest nerves that we're going to be talking about when we get to physiology. So again, make sure you know the names of the cranial nerves and where they innervate. So the vagus nerve will go from the brain, and it'll slow your heart rate and breathing rate. The facial nerve will go directly from your brain and innervate the facial muscles. So read through these and make sure you understand where they're innervating out of the brain. The rest of this PowerPoint are usually used for lab exam, but for purposes of what's happening during this particular semester, I'm going to just use this picture. Make sure you memorize this picture. These are the 12 cranial nerves and where they exit out of the brain. If we were in lab, you would actually have to do this on an actual sheep brain, which makes it much, much more difficult. So you guys kind of lucked out on this particular topic. So here are your olfactory nerves. Here are the optic nerves. This and this are called oculomotor nerves. You've got the trochlear nerves, and I'm just going to clarify where this is. So the black line, it's supposed to be to this one here. So that's a trochlear nerve, and that's a trochlear nerve. The one right next to it is the trigeminal nerve, abducens nerve. Then you have the facial nerve here right at the top, this top nerve right here. Then you've got the vestibulocochlear nerve right below it. Below that, glossopharyngeal nerve. Below that, vagus nerve. Below that, this whole thing is the accessory nerve. And this one in the middle here and in the middle here is called the hypoglossal nerve. Make sure you know this illustration. You also have a version of this in your lab manual that is slightly different. Please be sure to look at that illustration as well, because sometimes the spacing of these nerves can be slightly more spaced than others, but at the end of the day, everything should be in the same place. The rest of these, you really don't have to look over. These guys are just illustrations individually of where the nerves are and how they innervate the different muscles. So if you'd like to look at these, you can. If not, they will not be tested on lecture or lab exam. So that was your first PowerPoint on the nervous system. You will get your next one in a day or two. Don't forget that these are going to be the only 2 PowerPoints on your next lecture exam, so not too big of a load for you. Please email me or contact me if you have any questions on any of this stuff, and I hope you're all having a great week. Talk to you soon.